I was primarily trained from the Birmingham Center for Contemporary Cultural Studies, which was an important left-wing, sort of sociology of culture studies that was at Birmingham University, which lasted from the early 60s to the early 1990s, which was shut down because it failed to score highly enough on the RAF. It was probably the only internationally recognized academic unit in the UK for several decades, and the RAF, which is a mechanism to create internationally recognized units, killed off the only one that existed in that time. About 90% of the people from the center, which was called, went to what's now New Universities of Polytechnics, to media studies, and that was really where a lot of people went to. But if people didn't go to the polys, if they went to other universities, one of the places which a lot of Birmingham people went to was Warwick. So there's Birmingham people sort of all throughout the university. Richard Dyer, who's no longer at the university, but who was the first professor of film in the UK. Charlotte Brunston, in the film department, she got her PhD from the center. Debbie Steinberg in sociology, myself in English, and a few others. So I just kind of wanted to give you a sense of what a Birmingham cultural studies approach would be, which fundamentally asks the relationship, or asks questions about the relation between social experience and contemporary or pop culture. So that's kind of really what I wanted to do today. Recently I've been thinking a lot about why there's been this recent rise of interest, in the zombie apocalypse phenomenon. Zombies are everywhere, right? Used to be vampires, now it's zombies. And so from a cultural studies perspective, the question is really why? What's the sort of social experience driving that? And that's really sort of what I wanted to do today. The Center for Disease Control and Prevention, which is the American governmental agency for disease control for epidemics, a few years ago published a pamphlet on zombie apocalypse or zombie preparedness. So this is just some of these things. Don't be a zombie, be prepared. Now the CDC, the reason why they did this is because the CDC wanted to get people to think about what are the kinds of things you do if there's a disaster like Katrina or Sandy or whatever, and they thought that they made a graphic novel or a comic book about the zombie apocalypse, and it was things about how to be prepared in terms of disaster. But it's that same kind of gesture about thinking about real conditions or real experience as it's related to or represented through pop culture. That's really what I'm trying to do for the talk. So I guess the theme of the talk will be get a kit, make a plan, be prepared. What I wanted to do is I wanted to start off with something close to what the CDC is, and I wanted to show something that many Americans are grappling with for real at this moment. I want to show a small clip from The Walking Dead. It might be a little graphic for some of you, so forewarned. And the sound is very bad here, so you're really going to have to struggle for the sound. I normally like to play video clips at like the highest possible volume I can.
I'll do it. Makes my husband. sorry. I'm sorry for not ever being there. I always thought there'd be more time. I'm here now. I'm here. I love you.
One of the tensions in contemporary healthcare at the moment involves the fact that medical science is able to keep the body's physical apparatus operating longer than its self-defining agency or cognitive range. So for instance, if you think about senile dementia, or the fact that people are living longer, and science is able to keep people living longer farther than they're actually people, as it were, their personalities. Americans generally try to be optimistic about things, and most of the stuff that I'm going to talk about is from America, although the same is true for Britain. So Americans like to be very optimistic about recuperation from illness. Certainly a lot of Hollywood and TV shows show people sort of getting better. But this is smashing against the reality today of declining quality of life, shaped by particularly acute costs of medical care in America. So that individuals, a lot of Americans have to work through a matrix of guilt, grief, and anger as they face what's called the do not resuscitate protocol. The moment when you're asked when you are going to kill your family members or friends or loved ones in the hospital. That is to say, when you sign a legal document that actually allows the withholding of medical care at the end of life or for the very ill. Palliative care clinicians, that's to say the people at hospitals who are responsible for just reducing pain, not trying to make people better, but just reducing pain at the end of the life. They don't like the term DNR anymore, and they prefer the term A&D, which is allow natural death, because they want to downplay the omission of medical intervention, because obviously people feel very guilty about this. But few individuals in America see a natural process of any kind in the landscape of blood, excrement, and industrial waste, which is the modern day hospital. And one of the problems in American society is that we don't really have a calibrated, or we don't have a reasoning public sphere to talk through the issues about what do we do with family members who are very, very ill in the last stages of life. How do we deal with that? So normally the institutions that would be responsible for allowing people to think through these very kind of difficult questions. And they're difficult questions because there's no right answer, right? And furthermore, when you make a decision, you will never know if that was the right answer. So at the personal individual level, they're very difficult. But unfortunately in America, the public sphere has been so polluted, it's become so contaminated, that it's impossible to think of these issues. And some examples would be Sarah Palin, who during the Obamacare debate went on about what she called death panels, which was really an attempt to make these kinds of rational decisions. Or there was the Terry Schiavo case during the Bush years, when there was a woman who was in persistent vegetative state, who the Republican Party had made a cause celebrity and said that she was actually alive. Afterwards, the fact that they showed this is just sort of a brain scan. In fact, she wasn't at all. But we really don't have a way of discussing these issues when our aging population is making the costs and concerns of end-life issues a really crucial concern in American debate. And you can just see by this graph that medical care in the US, and of course this is a story which is going to come to Britain if the Tories have their way in reconstructing the NHS, but you can see how in a very short period of time medical care costs, and these are mostly, Medicaid is the program for people who don't have any other money, so it's really medical costs for the poor and the elderly. 90% of all Medicaid costs come in the last 2 years of life. So really what we're looking at is end-of-life issues. You can see that not only have costs more than doubled, but the interesting part of this graph is the blue part, which they say home and community-based care, which means that care has been shifted from institutions onto families. So there's been this real crisis at the personal level as the public state is withdrawing support for these very expensive situations and forcing it back onto individuals. And so this is becoming much more a sort of home trauma as we move into sort of neoliberalism and the de-privatized state. So I think one of the reasons why zombies have become popular, particularly with the generic scene of having to kill the infected before they reanimate, which is what I showed you from The Walking Dead, or take responsibility for the family. The character Carol, who has to sort of kill her husband, and she says it's my responsibility. It's not the community's responsibility. It's the individual's responsibility. Or the sight of loved ones now incoherent and wandering around in a confused fashion, the sort of zombie walk. I think The Walking Dead acts in the first instance as a means for people to rehearse inevitable decisions over life support and senior health care. That is to say, when we're watching family members walking around confused, that is just literally a representation of family members as they're getting older and becoming more incoherent. So the popularity of zombie figurations marks a signal crisis of social reproduction in Western society that ties individual singularities with general features of capitalism. If you know me, you know capitalism is going to be in the picture, so I'm going to talk a little about that. With the particularities of the present crisis in neoliberal capitalism and how it impacts you today. So what I want to do is I want to speak very briefly about 3 levels: cultural artifact, zombie films, a little bit about method, and then something about periodization of the contemporary moment. Okay, so that's the map that I said. Because life termination decisions are centrally ones about determining equivalence, where we're asked to determine the value of time against diminished vibrancy and finances, people are forced to ask the question, well, is one more month of grandfather's life, which might cost $20,000 or £20,000, is one more life of a grandparent who's not very well worth, let's say, a year's tuition for the grandchild, right? That's the kind of decisions that Americans are constantly being forced to ask. Is it worthwhile going into debt so we can have 3 more weeks? But what about all the money that we spent for those 3 more weeks? What else could that have been done? So what it does is it sort of pits the generations against each other. But it also forces the people to think in terms, to think about incommensurate or difficult things to compare, to think about how they might make that kind of decision, 1 month versus 1 year. Because of this, they focus attention to a known but inconvenient truth about the primacy of money in capitalist societies as a standard of value between 2 otherwise incommensurate commodities. And this is just Marx's circuit of commodity capital. I won't go into that at the moment. I want to argue that cultural studies needs to be attentive to the metaphors and figurations of zombies, not simply because we want to be sensitive to the existential trauma of bodily decline, but those people coming in the doors, right? That's not a stage effect, right? So we need to pay attention. It's not because we want to be sensitive to people whose family members are in this situation, but that the healthcare crisis is an example of how many people come to face the realities of capitalism as a life structure that depends on draining life for profit. That is to say, sort of makes one of the things that capitalism does is it makes zombies of us all. And one of the things that The Walking Dead TV show, if you've been watching this, sort of adds to the genre is the notion that everybody is a zombie. That, because they claim that every person who dies, regardless on whether they've been attacked by zombies or not, will become a zombie. And I think they've really captured something about the general features of zombie life in the contemporary moment. But the thing is, we all experience capitalism. None of us needs to be educated about the pressures of capitalism. But the thing is, we usually experience it in a muffled form through the hegemony of the everyday, where we're told don't ask questions. This is just the way it is. Or to use the phrase of Thatcher, there's no alternative. This is the normal. The thing about extreme distressing events like a family illness is they force us to cross a threshold because they amplify the dull pain of the everyday that's expected to be otherwise managed as normal or background noise, and they sort of bring it to the fore. Many of us don't actually think about the costs of healthcare until there's a crisis of healthcare. And it's in those moments that you start to then think about these larger issues that otherwise are sort of kept in the background or pushed into the far distant future. Because who, after all, wants to think about being ill, right? Or death, or all of these things. These are things that we know are going to happen, right? We're all going to die, but we'd rather not think about it. But it's when we're forced to think about it, it also forces us to think about other larger issues as a kind of response. What I want to argue is that the repetitions of genre, of generic culture like zombies, do a kind of bridging work, where these genre texts go beyond simply thematizing a crisis, even while they fall short of critically theorizing it. They create a platform that uses shocking scenes that try to go and push beyond the horizon of the everyday for a general population. And one of the things that genre or pop culture does is it pushes people to that direction of thinking about this larger social systems or larger social structures that operate them, even while it doesn't provide a full-fledged, full-flown theory. But it takes a theme and then it does a kind of work, sort of in-between work. And that's what I think these zombies representations are doing in ways that I'll talk about. So in other words, genre novels or TV or films mediate between experience and analysis, linking both while also being different from one another. More importantly, they provide a way for us to prepare and to practice what our responses are going to be to emergencies or times of transformation. They're kind of laboratory where we get to practice thinking about not only what we think about these things, but how we feel about these things. And TV shows particularly do this very well, where the really popular TV shows provide this mechanism where we watch them not simply to find out what the plot is or to see who lives or who dies, but really for the kind of emotional work that we're doing, like the clip that I showed, where we get a sister working through her relationship to her sister. Lots of times we don't really know what our emotional response to events are going to be, and that's what contemporary culture does. It prepares us for these moments, and it gives us a kind of language for when these events take place. And the better ones provide it more quickly. But more to the point, the reason why contemporary cultural things like these TV shows have become so massively successful, and for people who normally wouldn't watch them. So for instance, why is The Walking Dead one of the most popular shows in America at the moment, or Game of Thrones? Is because the official institutions that should prepare us, that's to say universities, churches, or religious organizations, political party or political discourse, have failed to do so at the current moment. The institutions that should be training us to experience historical change simply have broken down. And so now we have to go to contemporary culture and contemporary marketplace to do this kind of stuff, because government or the public sphere simply no longer works. And it no longer works because it was designed to no longer work through this sort of pushes towards the privatization of the marketplace, which I'll go on for a little bit. So when certain figures, like zombies, swarm at particular moments, when the undead are everywhere, then the signal crisis has become a more general, more universal, or what we call a conjunctural crisis. It's a complex moment when multiple emergencies overlap to change a period's metabolism. And for this reason, I want to argue that there is a difference between zombies and the fan world spheres, what we used to call subculture. We don't call it subculture anymore. I'll just say fan world. And mass commercial broadcasts. That they're not the same thing anymore. When something becomes mass culture, like the TV show, when AMC, when millions of people are watching this every week, it's an entirely different object from the past, or sort of fans. So my initial point today was the AMC's Walking Dead, rather than Robert Kirkman's graphic novels, which, although are quite widely read now, weren't. up until the TV show, or other lesser-known zombie films. The reason is because fan world's language is what Marxist critic Frederick Jameson operates on what he calls a strategy of containment. Fans' obsession with the serial listing of the formal rules that certify a text's inclusion within a genre. In other words, what makes a zombie film, right? You know, they sort of very careful delineation. They too successfully protect people within a kind of psychological green zone because it too successfully dampens the pain of what the representations are within these sort of formal rules. And so subculture does a certain kind of job, but it does it so successfly that it's not as interesting for us because it's just harder to get at what's really driving it because it does it really well. It's very tightly controlled. But when cultural values are set in motion and circulate beyond subcultures, when they go from the subculture to the mainstream, they become a different object and they do a different kind of work because the greater horizon provides a more widespread perspective onto the total set of social relations. So let me be clear. I don't want to argue that subcultures versus mainstream things, that one is more correct or more authentic than the other. I don't want to argue that one is better or worse than the other. What I want to argue is they do two entirely different kinds of operations. And my interest here is not in subculture, but is in mass culture, it's contemporary culture. Because I want to ask the question, what really are these films and TVs doing at the moment? What's the social experience that is looking for clues on how people should live their life or respond to the crisis through these types of things? Subculture more effectively manages the pain, but the mass market brings together larger elements. And so it allows us to sort of look at the horizon much more closely. So to go back to where I started, that hospitalization and end-of-life decisions matter to The Walking Dead should be clear because it repeatedly returns to these situations. Now this I actually have taken from the Robert Kirkman Walking Dead graphic novel, simply because it shows this. But for those of you who are familiar with The Walking Dead, it begins with an Atlanta sheriff who's shot and ends up in a hospital bed and then wakes up to find that zombies are everywhere, right? It's a zombie apocalypse. Now of course, the premise of that means that everything that we see after this initial point is not necessarily real. It might be just a hospital bed dream, right? Because we never see the explanation for how the zombie apocalypse turned. So for instance, if you've ever watched Life on Mars, where it plays that same sort of thing, or The Singing Detective, which is probably an older film, older TV show that not that many people know. But it all played with that notion that it was a sort of hospital bed fantasy. And there is a certain way that that's really what The Walking Dead is about. It's about what it's like to be in the hospital bed. But The Walking Dead TV show is actually much more interested in end-of-life issues than the graphic novels are. The graphic novels are often obsessed with amputation. That's one of their themes, and sort of construction society. This is an episode from the last show of season 1 where they're at the CDC outlet, and there's a scientist who's trying to find out the origin of infection on what is his wife, as we find out. And he shows a sort of video of the infection of the sort of the brain scan going on. But almost repeatedly, if you're fans of the show, you know that these issues come back about healthcare. There's the character Herschel, who cares for the zombies because he thinks that the infected can recover with a cure. He's a doctor. One of the character's first decisions is to euthanize a zombie girl called Bicycle Girl in the scene. We see the Centers for Disease Control experiments, and more recently, if you're watching this week by internet piracy, you know that there was a key scene where a son decided to euthanize his mother after a cesarean section. The TV show differs from the comics at various points, if you're familiar with both those texts. And usually the TV show always changes things because it wants to go back to this question of hospitalization and what do you do with people at the end of their life. So it's not really an interpretation, I'd argue, that The Walking Dead is primarily concerned with not zombies so much, but healthcare issues for those issues. Basically what I wanted to argue is that using allegory is not a very good way of looking at these. Allegory assumes that Z is X. So there are allegorical readings of zombies, earlier ones. Zombies are the working class, a proletarian rebellion. Or zombies are black anger. So if you've ever seen, I think it's Land of the Dead, which is the third Romero zombie film, which stages, there's sort of as zombies start to become sentient, they start to recover their images. There's a character, a zombie, big black African-American male called Big Daddy, who sort of raises a sort of zombie revolt. That's kind of an allegorical reading, Z equals X. I don't think that's a good way of approaching these things, partly because you don't need to have an allegory to understand what these texts are trying to do. I don't think, for the clip that I've shown you, or for the examples which I've shown you, we don't have to allegorize these shows as about end-of-life issues, because they are literally representing end-of-life issues, right? It's not an interpretive gesture. We don't have to say, this really means that, because they are actually showing us what they want us to think about. Now, they're showing us what they want to think about through extreme situations, right? Through zombie apocalypse. But that's the point. The point is they're trying to show us an event and then encouraging us to think at the margins of the everyday, to think of the margins of what we normally experience as normal. Now, they usually do this to the Gothic or the abnormal, but because they want to say there's a crisis out there. It might not be a crisis of reanimation or infection or whatever, but it's linked to that. But really, the point that I wanted to return to is in the absence of mediums of public discussion, genre steps in to allow us to practice what are possible emotional and enacted responses might be. What I'm interested in, I'm not going to show it right now, but to give you an indication on why one zombie film is not the same, if there's time at the end, I'll just show you a clip from White Zombie, which was the first zombie film. It's a 1934 film, and with Bela Lugosi, when the studios, Bela Lugosi had just come off Dracula, the studios wanted to make him into a star, and so they were coming up with all these films, and many of them are zombie films. Maybe if there's just an end, I'll show it. But really, that clip, it's about zombies not as cannibals. That's the thing that George Romero invented in the sort of the 1960s. But zombies as undead laborer, and there's a sort of scene of zombies working in a sugarcane mill, and then one of them falls into the pit, so you're having a little bit of zombie with your sugar. But it's really just about working class, the problems of controlling the working class. There's a character who comes in, and Bela Lugosi sort of says, oh, they're very good workers. And so the reason why zombies are used for that, because it's the Depression. And so working class issues are really the crisis of that moment. We're in a different kind of crisis, and I'll say a little bit more about that in the end. But what fascinates me, what makes, I think, the zombies of the current moment different from the Romero films is the point of view. Where increasingly, when we watch zombie films, we both want to be with human against the zombie and kill it. So you might want to think about like Rage or these other video games. But also increasingly people want to be the zombie. They want to walk in its shoes. That's what's significant about the current moment. So we get the rise of zombie walks. This is a zombie, one of the earlier one in Sydney. Of course, walking past the bank, the Central Bank of Australia. This is from Rochester, Minnesota, Invasion of Boringtown, it reads underneath. And more closely to home is the Birmingham zombie walks. Many of you, some of you have probably even participated in that. Interestingly enough, the purpose of the zombie walk was to raise money for a children's hospital, right? I was at a talk that said a lot of zombie walks are done for disaster relief, particularly in Haiti. And so there's this kind of weird conversation about zombies as Haitian, but also doing a zombie walk. What is it about the current moment that makes us want to be the zombie for the first time? This, for instance, this is I, Zombie, which is a post-Buffy the Vampire graphic novel set in Seattle about a teenage woman who's a zombie. And so you get the sort of the dual identity. So everyday teenage life is the search for brains. Colson Whitehead. The other is most recent, 2001, Zone 1. which is a zombie novel. And what's fascinating is you get writers who begin their career as high-value writers who are increasingly becoming zombies. This is not to give away the ending, but here's the ending of the book. It's the last line, which is about Zone 1, which is Manhattan, which has been overtaken by zombies, and there's an attempt to sort of cleanse Manhattan of zombies as kind of promotional device. And the main character realized it's a failed project. He said, fuck it, he thought, you have to learn how to swim sometime. And he opened the door and walked into the sea dead. So he's choosing to become a zombie. That's a very different kind of ending from, let's say, I Am Legend, which was made into 4 films most recently, where the hero, as it was, always escapes zombiedom. Now that's no longer the case. Increasingly, people are sort of recognizing their links to the zombies, as it were. And so why is that? Why might we want to be a zombie? Well, one reason is that zombies might be imprisoned within the realm of necessity. They need flesh and brains. But the other cool thing about being a zombie is that it frees you from the pain of life. The pain of fear, anxiety, unfulfilled sexual desire, because you want things, but it's, you're not worried if you're going to get a date. As it were. Zombies are together, but they're never in a community, so they don't have to worry about social pressure, right? Bullying. No zombie is ever bullied by another zombie. They're always sort of at home. And so that's kind of nice. It's sort of nice to sort of think of these things from how terrible, human life is terrible. So zombie life is good. So it's very attractive. So not only, they also provide a kind of utopia. From the release of pain, and they thematize this even if they sort of don't provide a full-blown situation. So really, what I want to argue is, for the first point, is that mass culture isn't stupid, that it actually is doing a kind of work, and that we should pay attention to the kind of work, and that it provides a certain insight into a crisis. My interest, I start off with this thing of healthcare crisis. But I've given this talk a number of times, and it's the only talk that I've given in my entire career where a lot of people come up to me afterwards and say, or come up to me like a week later and say, I haven't been able to stop thinking about this thing of healthcare. But it's usually people who are over the age of 30, people who are starting to face the problem of what you do with their parents. There's a kind of generational difference. So I wanted to talk about why this might matter to you. And it comes from largely a comment by 2 French economists in a book last year, The Crisis of Neoliberalism, where they argue through long wave economic cycles that we're in a particular kind of crisis. One of the crises, of course, is that we're in a time of large social inequality. This is just what a map from there's about inequality. The 20s, the Depression was very unequal, we're at the unequal. I grew up in this phase. This is in America. So actually, my life at your point was actually very different, not simply because I'm older, but because more or less I actually did grow up in a more equal America than the one today. It's just very different. I don't think of the America I grew up, I was educated by the state, and I don't remember it as being so dominated by money concerns. And I don't think that was simply nostalgia for the youth, but the economic data shows that actually money didn't matter as much. So they argue that there are 2 recurring cycles, and I won't go into this, but basically they consider that we're in a crisis much like the Great Depression. Dumas and Levy argue that neoliberalism is in a crisis, that it's simply no longer working today anymore, and that we're in a crisis of what they call financial hegemony, which is the various kinds of social alliances that go on. And they argue that there's 3 social forces that decide to converge and divorce from one another. There's the business class, there's the middle class, which they call managerials or professionals, that's us, and then there's what they call the popular or working class. And the history of the 20th century and the 21st century is the various relationships on who the middle class decides to align themselves with. And they argue that in the 1930s, because of the crisis of the Depression, the middle class realized that the business class was not competent enough to run the economy, that they were too stupid to run the marketplace. Business people are usually very good at something, making money, but they're not very good at many other things, like running a society or doing other things. And so the 1930s the middle class said, we can't trust wealthy people to run society anymore, and we want to have one of our own running it. And that meant that economics, so they chose an academic, John Maynard Keynes, who had never run a company in his life. And for 50 or 60 years, the middle class, the professional class, ran things on its own until the 1970s, when they argue that the middle class decided to, and the other thing about the 1930s is the middle class decided to align itself with the working class in what in America is called the New Deal, or in Britain is called the welfare state. By the 70s, the middle class got tired of aligning itself with the working class and decided that they wanted to be with the rich guys. And what they argue now, because of this crisis, is the middle class is in a position of choice. And they can either double down and work with the wealthy, or they can realign themselves with the working class. And that's a very kind of interesting sort of moment, and in many ways Occupy Wall Street, the main function of that, which was university students and unions, was an attempt to prepare the middle class to think about what it might be like for people like you, who instead of thinking in your minds, where do I want to go after university? Do I want to go with the Alan Sugars of this world, right, and become an apprentice to the wealthy? Or maybe, since the wealthy has so spectacularly failed, I'd be better off working with the middle class, with the working class. That's not to say to become the working class, but it's to align yourself with the working class. Now that's a very difficult kind of operation because it goes against the grain, to use the title of the group, of everything you've been trained for, the reason why you work. Your parents didn't send you to Warwick to come out of here and say, you know what, the working class is a better sense of how the society should be running than the business class, you know? So there's a kind of confusion in this, and that confusion requires a kind of thinking through, and you're not going to get that kind of thinking through from the government or the church or the university, and so where would you find that thinking through? You'd find it in pop culture. So for instance, if you look at shows like The Walking Dead, one of the things The Walking Dead does is it revises what in America is called the platoon movie, where it brings together different classes together and sees how they work. And if you watch the show, how many people do watch the show? If you want, not that many, so these examples don't make sense. Well, it's about some middle class people like a lawyer or some professionals, and then it's got some white trash characters. And what happens through the progression of the show is the white trash characters get more and more authority and prestige. They're listened to more carefully. And so what that show is really doing is it's preparing a kind of mainstream audience to start paying attention to the people who are otherwise invisible in their lives, the people who do manual labor, who provide kinds of services. And the reason for that is because, particularly in America, what the middle class is realizing is a very painful truth, which is to say, global capitalism no longer has any need for the Western middle class. Now we know that's been true for the Western working class for a long time. But what's new about the current moment is that capitalism simply no longer needs us. It doesn't need us because there's a much more attractive middle class out there, and that's the rising middle class of South Asia, India, and China. And it's East and South Asian bourgeoisie that is the main interest for these. And so the middle class at home is being left simply as a target for its assets to be stripped. And its assets are going to be stripped through increasing costs of university, home, and healthcare, which are the three features which really define what it means to have middle class status. And that's a very painful realization for a lot of people to realize that for capitalism, we are the undead, right? We're around, we're walking around, but we really don't serve any kind of purpose. There's a kind of crisis. I just want to take the last few moments to sort of explain how this crisis matters to you. These are American statistics, but like I said, these are going to be British statistics in a few years. This is the cost of student loan debt in the US. There was a housing bubble, but notice that student debt has really sort of increased much further. 1990, roughly my age, this was the size of student debt. This is the size of it in America at the current moment. Again, first-year students, are there any first-year students in the room? 27,000 pounds, right? You know, when I came to Warwick 14 years ago, it was free. right? Now it costs £27,000. Student debt, there is more student debt than private debt. One of the problems in the crisis is that economics is very good about managing state debt, but it's not very good about how to manage private debt. So there was a certain point where credit card debt was larger than public debt. The problem is student debt is now larger than credit card debt in America. That's just another graph which shows that the inflation rate of education has really gone up even more than homes. This is, again, rising costs. This is the California system, which is the largest educational system in America. Medium income, how much money people get is here. That's to say, if you're middle class, your salary is increased by this much, but the cost of getting the middle class, that's relatively self-evident. I like this graph. This is California. This is about the amount of money which California puts into the public educational system versus how much money it pays for the prison system. And you can see the green is prisons. So California is more interested in investing in prisons than it is in education, even though it costs about $60,000 a year to keep someone in prison, about $20,000 to educate somebody. So you might think, well, what's the extra value of that? The value of that is in America, if you're convicted of a felony, you're forever prevented from the right to vote. You become what's called socially undead. And so California, obviously, is a crisis state, particularly for the Republican Party, because it's not a white state anymore. So how do you delay the onset of the death of whiteness, which was a big debate, as you criminalize lots of non-white people, you put them in prisons. This is just more graphs about how student debt has increased. But the problem with student debt is that it remains with you forever. It's literally zombie debt. And the reason why is because in 2005, the bankruptcy laws were changed in the US so that student debt is unforgivable. You can't be freed from it in bankruptcy. So if you take out student debt, you keep it for life. And the government can take your wages. If you get a job, they can go to your employer, and the money will go directly from your pay packet into your government. There's almost no way to remove it, which many people feel is a violation of the 13th Amendment, which was the constitutional amendment which prohibited slavery except if you're in prison. We still have slavery in America for people who are in jail. The Constitution says that's okay. But it's a return to what's called debt peonage. That is to say, you take on the debt to have a kind of good life, but it really makes you dead, right? So the university is a sort of zombie laboratory, a zombie generator. And this has been a concern, particularly in North America. This is from the Canadian movement. We are all in the red. I was just down in London last week, and I noticed that people were wearing the red square for education. Casserole revolution, which bringing pots and pans. Lots of times people think that student revolts aren't useful, aren't successful, but actually this brought down the government in Quebec province. About 2 months ago, the Liberal government, which said that they wouldn't negotiate with the students, was kicked out of the government. So this was an extremely successful protest. But more recently in New York, the combination of students and Occupy Wall Street students have taken on this question of debt, and they did a Night of the Living Debt. Hello, my name is $50,000, and did a march on Wall Street as zombies. So they've taken on this theme of zombie walks, and they've changed it away from the healthcare crisis, which isn't really a crisis for most people in their early 20s, but they used it as a language to talk about that which is untalkable in the current American moment, which is the student debt crisis. The fact that we are literally turning young people into socially undead creatures. We're making them dead before they've sort of had the moment to live their lives, and there's a kind of crisis. I'll end just with this one. This is a California college. He's dressed as a clown, and I think it's because if you know the Romero films, George Romero is obsessed with zombie clowns. There's one in almost every film. But he says, we're dressed like zombies because the debt is killing us. And in some ways, that's sort of really where I wanted to end with the first image of this that I started with, which is, what is your kit for zombie apocalypse of student debt? How are you preparing yourself for the world which is being made for you, not to live in, but to be unlive in. And I'll end it there. I know I spoke for more than 40 minutes. So
I was wondering, well, if you had to propose sort of an alternative, alternate world system, do you have one in mind which could perhaps, or is it simply a critique?
well, does that fall under the category of rhetorical questions?
No, it's actually a question.
As a socialist, I believe in a post-capitalist world. I believe university education should be free. Which it once was. I think we need to return to a defense of the state. Now the problem is, in the current moment, one of the things that's taking place in the current moment is that we've got like a thudding through of all of our social institutions which we're seeing as corrupt, right? It's the Jimmy Savile case, it's the Lance Armstrong scandal, it's the MP Parliament crises, it's the child sex scandal with the church. And so we've learned to be very resentful of the fact that increasingly we recognize that there's a rule for them, the elites, and there's a rule for us. And in this case, we're not part of the elites, right? We're not part of that 1%. And so people don't like the state or these institutions anymore. And that's extremely useful for the real 1%, because the real 1% doesn't like these public institutions either. Because the public institutions are were created to protect people, the population, from the ravages of capitalism. And so the problem is we have a stupid and corrupt government. But we shouldn't fall into the trap of thinking, as, let's say, some of my more anarchist-minded colleagues in Occupy Wall Street, that government is bad, or that public institutions are bad. We need public institutions. What we need is truly democratic public institutions, which we do not have today. So in a certain sense, we are in a crisis of democracy, and regardless of whether you are capitalist or a Marxist or not. And I should say Marxist capital can be reduced to one sentence, which is people should be paid fairly for what they work, right? If you think that, you're more of a Marxist than you realize. That's what it all comes down to, is that people should be paid for what they actually do, not paid less. If you don't want to be a Marxist, that's fine, but I do think we need to reclaim democratic institutions that are organizing society, whether it's for healthcare, whether it's for housing, whether it's for education. And that's why that language of Occupy was such a useful language, regardless of what actually happened to Occupy Wall Street, is that we actually do need to occupy these institutions again. We can't give up faith on them. And so that would be, you know, aside from the sort of the larger socialist project or the communist project, I would say we do need to take seriously governance.
Thank you.
If that sounds good to you, we're having an anti-cuts meeting in 5 minutes. Sorry to interrupt.
Or for everybody else. You want to announce where it is?
SNS 13, just
I was going to ask you about your views on class rhetoric, as in the Crisis of Neoliberalism book. Definitely stuck with a upper, middle, and working class. And to me, the Occupy movement seemed to attempt to turn that on its head with a 99%. And if you look at the growth of student debt in America as well, I thought that showed like the middle classization of society, or however you want to see it. And I was wondering where you think the like traditional Marxist class rhetoric fits in with that, and whether you think it's still relevant to our society.
Well, I think that we can't be Marxists like Marx was anymore, because we don't live in Marxist capitalism. We live in there's a moment in The Wire, the TV show, which is something else I'm really interested in, where there's a drug dealer who's been in prison and he gets out and he's trying to re-enter. And he says to one character, well, the game's, it's gotten a lot worse. And the younger drug dealer says, the game's the game, it just got fiercer. And that's the case with capitalism. It's got general features, but it's also much harsher. And so I think that we can't simply know what it means to be a Marxist. We have to reinvent every day and in new ways what it means to be a Marxist. And I think in certain ways, the sort of classical notion of industrial proletariat just is not there anymore. That's not to say that there aren't industrial proletariats out there. They're just not there so much in the West, right? They're in Asia and they're in China. And so there's a need for international solidarity. But I think we need to sort of think more seriously about the principles underlining this. And principles like public service as opposed to private initiatives or incentives, right? In other words, you do think, the old Marxist slogan was from each according to their needs, to each according to their abilities, which is basically you do what you can so that to help everybody, right? That's kind of like the simplest version of that. And I think that's where we ought to be at the moment. In other words, not to think of how this benefits myself, but how I can do public service. And I think in some ways, that has, I don't know, and one of the things that fascinated me about Occupy was the kind of religious language that crept into it. And traditionally, Marxism is thought to be over here, and religious people are over there, because Marx wasn't a big fan of religion, among one of his things. And I think that kind of division isn't helpful at the current moment, you know. So really, there are left-wing religious sensibilities out there. In America, there's the Catholic Workers League. Buddhism, a sort of variety of Buddhism or yoga is very popular. And so I think that, you know, one of the things that I would say is that we don't have to fear religion. We just have to fear certain kinds of religion, like a Republican fundamentalist Christianity, which isn't Christian at all, in my opinion, although I'm not Christian, so I can't say that. But I think we just have to be a little more flexible in sort of broad church. I don't know if that answers what you Okay, go ahead.
You mentioned that the concept of zombies as a sort of end-of-life distance resonates particularly with over 30s. I was wondering how you reconcile that with the main consumer demographic for zombie media being college-age males, and whether you think that's entirely due to student debt concerns, and if that's the case, whether you think zombie media reflects student debt concerns in the same way as, say, healthcare issues, or whether it's simply been appropriated by these kind of movements.
I think I don't think it's been appropriated. I think it works complexly. So I think it's definitely about debt as one part of the crisis. There are three crises that are over-determining now for the Western middle class. It's housing, healthcare, and education, or job security would be the last. And all of those get played out into The Walking Dead. But I don't think that I think that what you find is that that main demographic of the sort of young white male viewership can't produce 9 million viewers a week, which is the viewing audience for The Walking Dead, which is also on AMC, which is a paid cable television show, which is to say the demographic of AMC or HBO or all the other cables is older, wealthier, and whiter for the most part. And so that's what, you know, it can't simply be the sort of the younger crowd that's doing that, although I think a lot of that, does that make sense? And I think one of the key roles, you know that something is being broadened when parody comes in, right? So if there was that moment of sort of zombie parodies, like Shaun of the Dead, or Fido. I don't know, you know, it depends on how much you really watch these, but there was a kind of Australian parody film. And the parody moments are very important because what that does is it opens up the language for audiences that normally wouldn't watch those kinds of films. And so, for instance, you know, there's a certain kind of person who will watch all the Romero films, but then a broad audience won't. And the sort of the comedy films say, teach people the language, and take it away from the fan world. But I do think, as I've tried to argue, that healthcare issues are a part of the crisis in the film. And if it weren't the case, then why does The Walking Dead spend so much time on these issues, particularly when those scenes are not in the original comics, right? Why do they put in these scenes? And I don't think it's simply for the sort of the male audience. You wouldn't, you know. That's a scene of sisters, right? That's, in other words, that's, you could say, like girls, young adult type fiction. Why would it be there if it was just for 18-year-old men? You know, does that make sense?
Yeah.
So I think we have to finish here.
Okay.
So thank you for the answers. And as far as I know, people are gathering later on in the Dirty Duck to continue the discussion, so you're welcome to join us, and everybody's
Or be
here.
against the cuts meeting.
Or against the cuts.